What if I told you that in the middle of Tennessee, in a town built entirely for war, there was a single house with a locked door, and behind that door, not weapons, not machines, but people, hidden lives, families who should not have survived, but did, a lock on the outside of a basement door, meant to keep them in, or perhaps to keep the world out. This isn't the kind of story you find in history textbooks, but once you hear it, you'll never forget it. Before we begin this journey, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to see how far this story travels. The morning air in Oak Ridge in 1945 carried a strange mixture of secrecy and routine. The small city, carved hastily out of the Tennessee Valley during the war years, hummed with the low murmur of engines and the shuffle of workers who filed past guarded checkpoints. The fences that ringed the settlement stood taller than most houses, topped with barbed wire that gleamed faintly in the rising sun. Inside those perimeters, lives unfolded in a rhythm known only to those who had been assigned there, and the world outside could only speculate on what truly happened behind the gates. To the residents, Oak Ridge was neither a town nor a camp. It was both a home and a machine. Entire neighborhoods sprang up in mere months, rows of prefabricated houses where scientists, engineers, clerks, and guards lived shoulder to shoulder. The grocery stores stocked flour and canned milk, the schools filled with children who whispered questions their parents never answered, and in the evenings the street lamps cast long shadows on sidewalks patrolled by military police. Among those shadows stood a man whose name, at the time, stirred little attention beyond the quiet circle of those who depended on him. His house, ordinary by any passing glance, bore no sign of what rested beneath its floorboards. The basement door was fitted with a lock, a heavy iron piece bolted to the outside frame. To visitors, the feature seemed odd, perhaps a remnant of hasty wartime construction. To those within, however, the lock was no accident. It was the first line of defense against discovery. His neighbors knew him as a mild-mannered employee attached to one of the sprawling facilities that dotted the hills around Oak Ridge. He wore the same issued badge as everyone else, entered the same guarded gates each morning, and disappeared into the same restricted buildings whose walls seemed to drink secrets. But within his basement, hidden from the inspections and the rigid order above, were families who bore stories from across the ocean. They were Jewish families who had fled Europe's terrors, only to find themselves once more living in fear, this time under the gaze of American military secrecy. At night, when the neighborhood lights dimmed and the hush of curfews settled, muffled voices would rise from beneath his house. Mothers lulled their children to silence. Fathers whispered updates passed like contraband through tenuous networks of trust. They lived in the space with the understanding that discovery would mean expulsion at best, imprisonment at worst. And above them, the man they relied upon moved carefully, balancing his daily obligations with the clandestine duty of keeping his household's secret intact. The war had shaped Oak Ridge into a place where secrets thrived. Every resident, from scientist to janitor, lived under instruction never to speak of their work. Questions were met with silence, curiosities with reprimand. In such a climate, it was possible for entire lives to vanish underground, so long as the right precautions were observed. The man understood this better than most, and he used the very fabric of Oak Ridge's secrecy to shield the families in his care. His decision had not come lightly. The months leading to it were paved with letters and coded conversations, the kind that carried fragments of lives torn apart overseas. Stories reached him of transports, of ghettos, of smoke that blotted the skies over cities he once knew by name. He listened, he read, And then he acted, arranging passage, securing ration books, and altering the story of his household until it aligned with the unquestionable face of normality. And so the lock on the outside became a symbol of both safety and imprisonment. To anyone glancing into the basement door, it suggested that the owner kept unwanted hands from rummaging through tools or supplies. To those inside, it meant the power to silence discovery rested in one man's steady hands. Above all, he knew that Oak Ridge itself was a paradox. It was a city that existed because of fear, built to produce a weapon intended to end the very war that had driven these families to hide. Its streets bustled with workers, its labs with guarded calculations, and yet beneath its surface another war raged, the battle to protect lives whose very existence stood at odds with the machinery of secrecy. In that basement, history's vast violence met the quiet defiance of shelter. And in that house, on that unremarkable street within Oak Ridge's fences, a story began to take shape, a story that would bind together the fate of the man, the families he hid, and the city that never fully knew what lived within its walls. The winter of 1945 pressed cold fingers against Oak Ridge. The hills surrounding the valley grew stark and bare, their trees stripped to bone-white silhouettes against slate skies. Smoke from chimneys rose in wavering plumes, vanishing into the chill air before reaching the low-lying clouds. Within the guarded perimeter, the rhythms of secrecy carried on undisturbed. Shifts changed at the laboratories, trucks rolled down gravel roads with tarps concealing their cargo, and soldiers at the gates checked passes with mechanical precision. Inside the man's house, the basement grew colder each night. The families huddled together on cots and makeshift bedding, their breath curling in faint clouds beneath the low ceiling. He had done his best to insulate the space with old blankets nailed across the walls and rugs scavenged from abandoned storerooms, but still the stone floor leached heat from their bodies. Food was rationed, not by regulation alone but by necessity, each meal carefully measured so that supplies could stretch for weeks without drawing suspicion from neighbors or the ration office. The man's daily routine masked the effort it took to sustain his hidden guests. Each morning he rose before dawn, lit the stove, and prepared enough bread and coffee for the household upstairs, while slipping extra portions into a basket that he would carry to the pantry. The basket descended with him quietly down the wooden steps, his hand brushing the door frame where the lock rested on the outside. He would unlatch it swiftly, step inside, and close the door again behind him. The families knew never to linger near the entrance, never to raise their voices when the door opened, for every creak of would carried the risk of betrayal. Children adapted fastest. Their games became silent ones, their laughter smothered behind hands or swallowed into pillows. They learned to move like shadows, to whisper songs without melody, to treat the rumble of boots overhead as signals to freeze in place. The mothers bore the heavier burden of explaining why such rules existed, crafting stories that softened the jagged truth. The fathers, restless and cramped, offered their labor where they could, mending furniture, reinforcing shelves, even helping to repair the lock that bound them in. Above them, the man cultivated an image of unremarkable reliability. His work at the facilities demanded long hours, but he made certain to appear punctual, methodical, obedient to the protocols that governed everyone's lives. He exchanged pleasantries with neighbors at the bus stop, waved to guards as though nothing weighed on his conscience, and answered routine inspections with calm composure. Behind every nod and smile lay calculations. How much flour to purchase without arousing suspicion, how to explain the disappearance of extra blankets, how to justify the steady burn of his firewood despite living alone. The lock on the basement door, though unusual, remained unquestioned. Oak ridge houses had been erected hastily, and quirks of construction were common. A latch on the outside could be dismissed as an eccentricity or a practical measure for storage. When asked, he explained it casually. The basement held tools, chemicals, or supplies that might be unsafe for children or intruders. No one pressed further. In a city where curiosity was dangerous, silence often sufficed as an answer. Nights were the most perilous. Curfews left the streets quiet, but quiet carried its own dangers. A dog barking at the wrong hour, a child coughing too loudly, or a soldier deciding to patrol an unfamiliar block, each posed the threat of unraveling the careful balance. The man often sat awake long after the rest of Oak Ridge had gone still, a lamp burning dimly in the upstairs parlor while he listened for any sound beyond the ordinary. The weight of responsibility pressed on him in those hours, a reminder that every life in the basement depended on his vigilance. Despite the fear, moments of humanity endured. On some nights, when the risk was low, he carried down a battered violin salvaged from a pawnshop in Knoxville. One of the fathers, once a musician in Europe, coaxed from it melodies so soft they seemed woven into the hum of the furnace. Children drifted to sleep under the music, and for brief moments the basement became something more than a shelter. It became a place where life still breathed, fragile yet unbroken. Outside, the war pressed toward its conclusion. Newspapers spoke of advances across Europe, of armies pushing back the darkness that had swallowed entire nations. Yet the families underground measured their lives not in battlefronts, but in days survived, in meals shared, in the trust they placed in the man above them. Each sunrise brought both dread and hope. Dread that discovery would arrive with the morning, hope that the world beyond Oak Ridge might one day open to them without locks or shadows. And so the days stretched into weeks, the weeks into months, with the lock on the outside standing as both shield and reminder. Above ground, Oak Ridge moved toward its role in history, its factories producing secrets that would soon alter the course of the world. Below ground, hidden lives endured, stitched together by quiet courage and the steadfast will of one man who refused to let fear dictate their fate. Spring crept into Oak Ridge slowly, as though the valley itself hesitated to shed winter's cloak. Buds appeared on the bare trees, hesitant green breaking against grey, and the muddy roads began to harden under warmer sun. For most residents, the season meant little beyond lighter coats and the promise of fresh produce trickling back into rationed markets. For those hidden beneath the man's house, however, the change carried weight. With warmth came relief from the chill that had seeped into their bones, but also new dangers. Windows were left open in the neighborhood, neighbors lingered outside in the evenings, and sound traveled differently in the shifting air. The man grew cautious in new ways. He adjusted routines, spreading his trips to the market across different days, purchasing from various stores to avoid patterns. He made excuses to his co-workers about small repairs at home that required him to carry lumber or boxes, materials that, in truth, were destined to reinforce the basement. He even began cultivating a small garden plot behind the house, a patch of tilled soil that masked the necessity of growing food for more mouths than anyone suspected. Life underground, though strained, found rhythm. The children's lessons continued under the guidance of mothers who scribbled on scraps of paper and used charcoal for writing when pencils grew scarce. The fathers held whispered debates in the evenings, discussing politics of a continent they might never see again, weighing rumors of liberation against the hard reality of displacement. At times, their voices grew heated, and the man upstairs would descend with calm authority, reminding them that sound could betray them all. In those moments, silence would return, heavy but necessary. The lock remained the constant presence. Every time it clicked shut from the outside, it sent a ripple of mixed emotions through the basement. Safety lay in the barrier it created, but so did the sting of captivity. Adults wrestled with the duality, knowing they had chosen this confinement as survival, while children grew up regarding it as simply the shape of life. The older ones sometimes pressed their ears to the door, listening to the muffled world above, asking when they might see the sky again. Their parents answered with patience, though uncertainty clouded every word. Above ground, Oak Ridge itself changed with the season. More workers arrived, more houses sprang up in tight rows, and rumors swirled about the purpose of the vast facilities whose chimneys exhaled day and night. Few dared to question openly, but whispers traveled. A weapon, something immense, something that would end the war. The man heard such whispers and carried them silently, never repeating them in the basement, never fueling the fragile hopes of those who relied on him. The most perilous moment of that spring came unexpectedly. One afternoon, as he returned from his shift, a military inspector stood at his door. The knock was sharp, official, the kind that froze blood. The man opened it with a steady hand, meeting the stern gaze of the officer who announced routine checks for security compliance. They entered the house together, boots on the wooden floor echoing above the hidden lives below. The officer examined windows, locks, and ration stamps pinned neatly on the kitchen wall. His gaze lingered on the basement door. "Unusual lock," the officer remarked, his voice neutral but heavy with implied authority. The man explained smoothly, his rehearsed answer leaving his lips without hesitation. Chemicals stored below, tools that could be dangerous, the lock installed to protect children from accidents. He spoke with the same calm tone he used every day at work, a tone that revealed nothing and invited no further inquiry. The officer tapped the lock once with his knuckle, then nodded and turned away. The inspection ended, the boots departed, and silence reclaimed the house. Only then did he unlock the basement door, stepping down to faces pale with fear. He reassured them quietly, telling the story of the officer's visit, omitting nothing. He did not lie to them, for trust was their strongest bond. The families listened, their gratitude unspoken but clear in the way they embraced their children tighter that night. The danger had passed, but the lesson endured. One careless sound, one suspicious detail, could bring everything to an end. As spring deepened, resilience grew alongside fear. The violin played again, its notes mingling with the hum of insects outside. Children learned songs in whispers, their voices braiding together like threads of survival. The man, weary yet resolute, kept watch as the season unfolded, knowing that every day added to the fragile ledger of lives preserved. And all the while, Oak Ridge advanced toward its destiny, its residents unaware that beneath one house on an ordinary street, history was being preserved in another form, not through the building of weapons, but through the stubborn act of keeping families alive in the face of unrelenting peril. By summer of 1945, the air in Oak Ridge grew heavy with heat and secrecy alike. The valley shimmered with the haze of long days, cicadas droning from the trees that now stood lush and green. Gardens sprouted in tidy rows behind many houses, each resident encouraged to plant their own victory plot to supplement rations. The man's garden flourished more than most, and neighbors remarked politely on his diligence. Few guessed that every tomato, every potato pulled from the soil, carried the weight of lives hidden beneath his floor. The basement was stifling in the summer heat. Blankets once nailed to the walls for warmth were stripped away, leaving bare stone that absorbed the day's warmth and radiated it long into the night. Air grew stagnant quickly, and the man wrestled with the problem of ventilation. Too much airflow risked sound escaping, too little risked suffocation. He devised solutions in secret. A concealed vent routed through an unused chimney flue, careful timing of when to open it, strict rules about when anyone could approach the narrow channel of fresh air. The families endured. Sweat soaked their clothes, sleep grew restless, but endurance had become second nature. Children, though weary, still found ways to play with scraps of cloth or marbles carved from wood. Parents told them stories of fields in springtime, of cities with cobblestone streets, of markets where voices rose freely. These stories were not only distraction but inheritance, a reminder of a world beyond confinement, a memory preserved until it could be lived again. Above ground, the atmosphere in Oak Ridge thickened not just with heat but with anticipation. Workers whispered of something momentous nearing completion. Security intensified. Passes were checked with greater scrutiny, and rumors of spies trickled through the ranks. Some spoke of Germany's defeat, others of a weapon so powerful it would force surrender in Japan. The man listened, absorbing the tremors of history moving toward climax, while never revealing what he knew to those in his care. Their survival depended on patience, not speculation. The lock on the basement door, by now part of the house's silent language, remained both guardian and warden. Its click echoed differently in summer, sharper, harsher in the heavy air. Each evening, when the man descended with food or water, the hidden families greeted him with a mixture of relief and weariness. Gratitude was constant, though seldom spoken aloud. Words carried too much weight, and silence remained their truest expression of trust. It was during one of those hot nights that the violin returned again. The musician's hands, though slick with sweat, coaxed notes that floated through the cramped space. The music was not triumphant but yearning, a sound that carried memories of freedom. Children swayed to it drowsily, parents closed their eyes, and for a moment the basement felt larger, filled with something greater than fear. Upstairs, the man sat at his desk, listening to the faintest trace of melody rising through the floorboards. He allowed himself a brief smile, though it quickly faded into the lines of worry etched into his face. Late that July, the tension of Oak Ridge reached a breaking point. Strange activity buzzed around the laboratories, convoys moved at odd hours, and workers disappeared for days at a time with no explanation. Then, in early August, news filtered in. A bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. Another followed days later in Nagasaki. The war, they said, was ending. The city erupted in cautious celebration. Banners unfurled, neighbors gathered in the streets, and yet the joy felt muted, complicated by the secrecy that had always shrouded their work. In the basement, the announcement came as both blessing and question. Liberation overseas meant the camps were being emptied, the transports halted. But what awaited those who had survived? The families huddled together, whispering hopes of reunion with lost relatives, of returning to places that might no longer exist, of beginning anew in lands far from Europe's ashes. The man listened, offering no promises but continuing his steady protection. The war might have ended, but their danger had not. Suspicion still lingered in Oak Ridge, and the machinery of secrecy remained in motion. Discovery could still mean ruin. So they waited, even as the world shifted outside. They waited through the August heat, through the parades that passed in the streets, through the return of soldiers to their families. In the stillness of the basement, Time felt both suspended and pressing. The children asked again when they might step into the sunlight. Their parents answered with the same patient words, though their own eyes burned with longing. And above them, the man continued his vigil, a guardian in a city of secrets, carrying on with quiet resolve as history thundered all around. The autumn of 1945 arrived with cool winds and the first fallen leaves scattered across Oak Ridge's sidewalks. The war had ended. Germany lay in ruins, Japan had surrendered, and the world's newspapers now spoke of peace, though the word carried a hollow tone for many who had endured loss too deep to be mended by treaties. Oak Ridge, once a city buzzing with urgent secrecy, shifted uneasily into its new role. Guards still patrolled, fences still loomed, but the sense of purpose that had bound the community during the war now faltered. Some workers prepared to leave, returning to hometowns or seeking work elsewhere. Others stayed, bound by habit, or because they could not yet imagine life beyond the gates. Rumors swirled that Oak Ridge would become permanent, transformed from wartime project into lasting settlement. For the man and those in his basement, the end of the war changed everything, and nothing. Safety no longer meant avoiding enemy suspicion. It meant navigating the uncertainties of a nation now deciding how to absorb the tides of displaced lives. The families underground did not yet dare to emerge. Immigration laws remained strict. Prejudice lingered in quiet corners, and Oak Ridge was still a place where questions could be as dangerous as answers. The man walked through the changing city with renewed caution. Celebrations erupted around him. Flags waved, children paraded in makeshift uniforms, and neighbors spoke loudly of victory. He smiled when expected, nodded when greeted, but inside his thoughts weighed heavy. He wondered how long he could sustain the balance, how much longer the basement could serve as shelter. Supplies remained manageable, thanks to the harvest from his garden and careful rationing, but time itself felt like a dwindling resource. Downstairs, the families wrestled with the paradox of freedom. They listened to reports smuggled through whispers, camps liberated, survivors scattered across Europe, nations arguing about where refugees should go. Some dreamed of America opening its arms, others of reaching Palestine, still others of returning to what homes remained. Yet each dream carried uncertainty, and none could be pursued from within the locked confines of Oak Ridge. The children grew restless. With the cool air came the urge to run, to chase leaves in the street, to feel grass beneath their feet. They pressed their parents with questions, sharper now than before. Why must they stay hidden when the war was over? Why did their lives remain bound to silence and shadows? Their parents struggled for answers, crafting careful words that balanced honesty with hope. The man, too, felt the children's eyes upon him. He had become more than guardian. He was teacher, provider, almost father to those who looked to him for the shape of their world. He bore the weight with quiet dignity, but in his solitude, doubts gnawed at him. Could he keep them safe indefinitely? Would discovery come not from soldiers, but from the curiosity of neighbors now less distracted by war? One evening, as the first frost settled on the valley, he gathered the families together in the basement. His voice, steady but firm, laid out the truth. The war was over, but their safety was not guaranteed. Leaving Oak Ridge would be perilous, but staying forever was impossible. He promised them that he would seek paths forward, connections in nearby cities, papers that might be forged, sympathizers who might guide them beyond the fences. For now, they must endure a little longer. The fathers nodded solemnly. Mothers held their children close, and silence followed his words. They trusted him, as they always had, because trust was the only currency left to them. Above, Oak Ridge prepared for its uncertain future, while beneath one house, families continued their quiet survival. The lock on the outside still clicked shut each night, a sound as familiar now as the ticking of a clock. It marked the passage of time in a world where days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and hope persisted even when freedom remained out of reach. The winter of 1946 bore down on Oak Ridge with a sharpness that settled into bone and lingered. Snow dusted the ridges around the valley, sometimes melting in the midday sun, sometimes freezing into a hard crust that crunched beneath boots. Chimneys smoked steadily, the smell of coal drifting through neighborhoods of houses hastily built but now weathering into permanence. The fences still stood, but the urgency of wartime was gone. Oak Ridge was transforming into a town trying to justify its own existence. Inside the man's house, the basement once again became a chamber of cold endurance. Blankets returned to the walls, rugs layered thick upon the floor, and every fire upstairs was carefully tended so that warmth could trickle downward. The families huddled together as they had the winter before, though this time the children carried sharper questions, and the parents sharper worries. The war was over, but the waiting remained. The man worked tirelessly to find paths forward. His job within the guarded facilities no longer demanded the same urgency, leaving him more time, though also more scrutiny. He traveled occasionally to Knoxville under the pretense of errands, but in truth he sought contacts who might help. Churches, aid organizations, even sympathetic clerks who could be persuaded to look the other way. He knocked on many doors, speaking carefully, never revealing everything. A slip of the tongue could undo months of protection. Sometimes he returned discouraged, carrying nothing but bread and kerosene. Other times he brought fragments of possibility. Mention of a relief agency forming in New York, whispers of Jewish organizations helping survivors, rumors of officials quietly sympathetic to the displaced. He shared these cautiously with the families, never offering promises, but always enough to remind them that hope was not extinguished. The lock on the outside remained their paradox. By now, even the children knew to avoid it. They no longer pressed their ears to the door. They had grown used to its presence, as though it were another wall, another inevitability of life. And yet, when the man descended the stairs with food or news, they always watched his hand turn the key. It was the gesture that divided their confinement from the world above, the symbol of both their dependence and their protection. In January, danger came again. A neighbor, passing by one evening, remarked on how much firewood the man seemed to consume. "You keep your place mighty warm," the neighbor said, half joking, half curious. The man replied with equal casualness, laughing softly about his poor insulation and his own intolerance for cold. The neighbor accepted the answer, but suspicion, even if fleeting, left its mark. That night, the man sat long at his desk, staring at the embers in the stove, knowing how thin the line was between ordinary curiosity and fatal discovery. The basement, however, found moments of warmth that had nothing to do with fire. On Friday evenings, the families lit small candles, shielding the flames with their hands, whispering prayers that stitched the present to generations before. The children learned the words from their parents' lips, their voices carrying traditions into the narrow space. These rituals, fragile yet unbroken, gave them strength. The man, though not part of their faith, sometimes stood quietly at the edge, head bowed, honoring the endurance that filled the room. Outside, America shifted into post-war life. Soldiers returned home, factories adjusted, families sought normalcy after years of sacrifice. Newspapers carried stories of trials in Nuremberg, of horrors laid bare before the world. The families underground listened to these reports with tears and silence. The names of places they had known were spoken in headlines. The truth of what they had fled was now printed for all to see. Yet in Oak Ridge, within the fences and secrecy, the world still seemed strangely distant, as though time lagged behind the barbed wire. By March, the man had made quiet arrangements. A contact in Knoxville hinted at a possible way forward, forged identification papers, transportation eastward, perhaps even a path toward organizations ready to resettle refugees. It was dangerous, uncertain, but it was more than they had before. He told the families to prepare, gather what little they possessed, keep ready for the night when he would come to lead them. They listened, hope flickering like the candlelight that had become their companion. They knew the risk, but they also knew that survival demanded courage. The basement could not be forever. The lock on the outside, once symbol of safety, had become a reminder that life waited elsewhere, beyond Oak Ridge, beyond secrecy, beyond shadows. And so they waited again, but now with a sense of expectation. The man's promise had become their anchor, and the coming spring carried not only the smell of thawing earth, but the possibility of release. The thaw of spring in 1946 brought mud to the streets of Oak Ridge, the kind that clung to boots and seeped into doorways. Birds returned to the valley, filling mornings with songs that had been absent all winter. For most residents, the season was one of renewal, of life resuming its ordinary course after years of war. But for the families in the basement, it marked the beginning of a countdown. They knew now that their time underground was nearing its end. The man moved with careful urgency. His contact in Knoxville had arranged forged identification papers, crude, but convincing enough if not scrutinized too closely. The names on the documents were chosen with care, borrowed from old records and softened to avoid suspicion. He had also secured travel by train, discreetly purchased tickets under the guise of visiting relatives. Every step carried risk, but risk was the only path to freedom. The families prepared in silence. Their belongings were meager: a few garments, a violin, scraps of paper filled with lessons and stories, photographs worn thin from being handled in the dark. Each item was packed with reverence, for they represented not possessions but fragments of identity. Parents whispered to their children about the journey ahead, about trains and cities, about stepping into the sun without fear. The children listened with wide eyes, some too young to remember the world outside, others old enough to remember too much. The lock on the outside, once a symbol of protection, now became a mark of finality. Each time the man turned it, the sound reminded them that their confinement would soon end. The children began to whisper about the moment it would click open for the last time, when the door would swing wide and they would not return to the shadows. Parents hushed them, wary of tempting fate, but even they allowed themselves quiet hope. Danger, however, grew sharper as the plan approached. The man sensed it in the glances of neighbors, in the way questions lingered a second too long. One afternoon, a co-worker joked about his frequent trips to Knoxville. "You got a sweetheart up there?" the man teased lightly, masking unease. The joke was harmless, but it was a reminder that attention, once drawn, could unravel everything. He doubled his precautions. Trips to town were staggered, explanations rehearsed, every detail aligned to appear ordinary. He kept his house spotless, ready for the possibility of sudden inspection. He ensured that the basement appeared empty to any casual glance, tools neatly arranged, crates stacked convincingly, no sign of the lives hidden just beyond sight. The night chosen for departure arrived in April. Rain lashed the valley, masking sounds and cloaking movements. The man descended the basement stairs with a lantern, his face grave but steady. "It is time," he said simply. The families rose quietly, gathering their bundles. Mothers lifted children into their arms. Fathers steadied trembling hands. The lock clicked open one final time. The door swung wide, and for the first time in many months, they stepped beyond its threshold, not into fear, but into the possibility of freedom. The air upstairs felt different, open, alive, filled with scents of rain and wood smoke. The children inhaled deeply, their eyes wide as though they had entered another world. The man led them with precision, every movement timed to the rhythm of rain and darkness. They slipped out the back door, avoiding street lamps, moving like shadows through the wet grass. The garden that had sustained them stood behind, its soil freshly turned, a silent witness to their passage. Reaching the outskirts of Oak Ridge was no small feet guards still patrolled, though less vigilantly than during the war. The man had studied their rotations, memorized blind spots, and chosen the night carefully. Heartbeats quickened as they approached the fence, the wire glistening in the rain. A section he had prepared, carefully, quietly over weeks, offered them passage. One by one, they crawled through, their breaths held, their eyes darting. When the last child passed safely, the man pulled the wire back into place. On the other side, the valley stretched dark and vast. Roads wound toward Knoxville, toward the train that would carry them eastward, toward lives that might finally unfold without locks and shadows. For the first time, the basement lay empty. The lock on the outside, its purpose fulfilled, hung silent against the doorframe. The house above, ordinary once more, stood as though nothing had ever stirred beneath it. Yet within its walls lingered the memory of survival, the echo of whispered prayers, the strain of music played in the dark, the quiet defiance of lives preserved against all odds. The man did not look back. His duty was not to the house, nor to the lock, but to the families who walked beside him into the uncertain night. The road to Knoxville stretched long and silent beneath the rain. Mud clung to boots, water trickled down collars, and every sound seemed amplified in the still night. The man led the way with steady resolve, lantern extinguished, guided only by memory and the faint outlines of trees against the storm-grey sky. Behind him, the families followed, a line of shadows, burdened with bundles that held their entire worlds. Children stumbled, their small feet sinking in the sodden earth, but their parents urged them onward in hushed tones. The rain, though miserable, was their ally. It muffled footsteps, blurred silhouettes, and kept watchful eyes indoors. The man had chosen this night precisely for its relentlessness. He knew the valley, knew its bends and gullies, knew how to move unseen. By dawn, they reached the outskirts of Knoxville. The city stirred with early wagons and the distant whistle of trains. Here, danger sharpened. Unlike Oak Ridge, where secrecy cloaked everyone, Knoxville was open, alive with questions. A group of strangers, weary, foreign in accent and manner, could draw notice. The man guided them into a safe house arranged by his contact, a narrow boarding house tucked along a quiet street. The proprietor, a woman with lines of both hardship and kindness etched in her face, welcomed them without words, only gestures. She knew better than to ask. For the first time in years, the families slept above ground. They lay on narrow cots, listening to the creak of floorboards instead of the hum of pipes, smelling bread baking in a kitchen instead of damp stone. Children pressed their faces to the window panes, marveling at the sight of morning sunlight breaking through clouds. The freedom felt fragile, as though a loud knock might shatter it at any moment. The man, meanwhile, went to secure the next step. The train eastward would carry them out of Tennessee, through the mountains, and toward cities where anonymity might be easier to sustain. Tickets were already purchased under false names. The risk lay not in boarding the train, but in enduring the eyes of conductors, the questions of fellow passengers, the scrutiny of officials who might patrol the cars. He returned to the boarding house with the papers. Each family received their forged identities, names that rolled unfamiliar on their tongues, birthdays that bore no truth, occupations invented to fit the times. Parents repeated them to their children until the details became second nature. A mistake, even a hesitation, could mean discovery. That evening, before departure, the families gathered once more in a small circle. Candles were lit, their flames trembling in the draught of the narrow room. Prayers rose quietly, not of confinement but of thanksgiving, of hope for safe passage. The man stood apart, hands clasped, watching the ritual with solemn respect. He had guided them this far, but the journey was not yet finished. The train station at Knoxville bustled with life the following morning. Soldiers in uniform, families reuniting, vendors calling out wares. The noise was a stark contrast to the silence of Oak Ridge. The man shepherded the families carefully, positioning them as though they were ordinary travelers. A child clutched a doll sewn from scraps. A mother adjusted her shawl. A father carried a satchel worn from years of hardship. They looked like any others, if one did not look too closely. Boarding the train was a test of nerves. The conductor glanced at each ticket, each paper, eyes flicking over faces. For one breathless moment, as he studied a forged identification card, the world seemed to still. Then, with a grunt, he punched the ticket and waved them aboard. Relief coursed through the group like a single heartbeat. The train lurched forward, its whistle piercing the morning air. Through rain-streaked windows, Tennessee hills rolled past, their misty ridges fading into distance. For the first time, the families felt the true movement of escape, not waiting in shadows, but traveling openly, their destination uncertain but their direction forward. The man sat among them, shoulders taut, watching every passerby with measured calm. He knew the journey ahead remained fraught. The basement was behind them, but the world beyond Oak Ridge carried dangers of its own. Papers could fail. Borders could close. Prejudice could surface in places where it hid behind polite smiles. And yet, as the wheels clattered over the tracks, he allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. They had left the valley alive. The lock on the outside, once their barrier, now lay behind them, silent and unused. Before them stretched the uncertain promise of a life unbound. The train wound eastward, its rhythm a steady clatter that lulled some into uneasy sleep, while others stared at the blur of mountains and valleys beyond the glass. For the hidden families, every passing mile carried them further from confinement, yet deeper into uncertainty. Their forged names rested on slips of paper folded tightly in pockets, their new identities memorized like scripture. Parents reminded children in hushed tones, "Never forget what name to answer to, never stumble if questioned. The man remained vigilant. Each stop brought new passengers, new eyes, and the risk of scrutiny. He positioned himself between the families and prying strangers, speaking when necessary, silent when possible. His gaze lingered on every uniform that boarded, every official who strode through the cars. More than once, his hand brushed against the inner pocket of his coat, where he carried the bundle of documents that bound their fate. By evening, the train entered larger towns where the world felt louder, less forgiving. Vendors bustled through the aisles, soldiers swapped stories of war, businessmen discussed rebuilding contracts. To the hidden families, it all seemed like a foreign play staged in a language both familiar and estranged. They were present, but not part of it, ghosts passing through the machinery of normal life. When the train finally slowed into Washington, D.C., their journey entered its most precarious stage. Here, scrutiny sharpened. The capital was alive with post-war bureaucracy, crowded with officials, soldiers, and refugees alike. The man guided the group swiftly through the station, avoiding the gaze of inspectors who watched the crowds. His contact had arranged for them to stay in a row house belonging to a sympathetic church leader, a man who had seen too much suffering to turn away from it. The row house was narrow and weathered, its brick facade blending into a line of similar buildings. Inside, however, it became a sanctuary. The families settled into cramped rooms, grateful simply to be above ground, to hear city noises instead of the hum of pipes. Children pressed their noses against the windows, marveling at the sight of streetcars rattling past, at the endless parade of strangers moving freely under open skies. In those rooms, plans shifted again. Papers would need to be improved, sponsors found, routes secured either toward New York or farther still. Some spoke of Palestine, others of joining relatives rumored to have survived in America. Every possibility required risk. Every choice demanded trust. The man worked tirelessly, reaching out to contacts through cautious channels. He visited offices where sympathetic clerks worked quietly after hours, churches that maintained lists of survivors, organizations piecing together the scattered remains of communities destroyed. He spoke sparingly, never revealing too much, but always pressing forward. Meanwhile, the families wrestled with the weight of waiting. The children, who had endured silence for so long, now filled the rooms with restless energy. They wanted to run, to shout, to live as children should. Parents tried to quiet them, fear still etched into their bones, but the city itself beckoned with noise and life. The tension between caution and yearning grew daily. One evening, the man returned with news. There was a chance for resettlement. Papers could be arranged through an agency in New York. Passage eastward would be possible if they remained cautious, if they continued to move like shadows. Hope flared again, fragile but undeniable. That night, they lit candles once more, their flames flickering against the walls of the row house. Prayers rose quietly, words of gratitude and supplication carried into the night. The man stood with them, silent, his face illuminated by the soft glow. He had guided them from the valley, through rain and wire, onto trains and into new cities. Yet his work was not finished. The basement in Oak Ridge lay far behind, its locks silent, its rooms empty. Ahead stretched a world uncertain, where survival would no longer depend on stone walls and secrecy, but on the fragile strength of papers, sponsors, and the kindness or indifference of strangers. And so they prepared once again, knowing that freedom was not a single door opening, but a series of thresholds, each crossed with fear, faith, and the will to endure. The final leg of the journey carried them north, toward New York, the city whispered of in refugee circles as both beacon and labyrinth. Its name was spoken in the basement months earlier as though it belonged to another world entirely. Now, as the train rolled through crowded corridors of factories and smoke, they approached it with trembling hearts. The man had prepared carefully. The forged documents had been strengthened through sympathetic hands in Washington, new seals pressed, new signatures inked with precision. Letters of reference, some genuine, some constructed, now accompanied them. In the eyes of bureaucracy, they were no longer displaced shadows, but families with identities, histories, and futures. When they arrived at Pennsylvania Station, the sheer immensity of New York overwhelmed them. The vaulted ceiling, the tide of humanity pressing in every direction, the cacophony of languages. It was more than the children had ever imagined. They clutched their parents' hands tightly, eyes darting from one marvel to the next. The parents themselves, though awestruck, bore faces taut with caution. Freedom had brought them here, but safety was still not guaranteed. A representative from a Jewish relief organization met them at the station. He was a man in his 50s, his suit worn but his manner brisk with purpose. His handshake with the man was firm, his words practical. Temporary housing arranged in the Lower East Side, medical checks scheduled, paperwork in progress for resettlement. The efficiency of it seemed almost unbelievable after months of silence and shadows. The families were brought to a tenement building near Delancey Street. The rooms were small, the stairways narrow, but the air was free of locks. From the windows, children watched markets bustling below, carts loaded with fruit, vendors calling out in Yiddish, Italian, English. For the first time, they began to feel part of a world rather than hidden from it. The man lingered only briefly. His work, he knew, was never meant to end in permanence. He was not their savior, only their steward through a chapter of survival. Yet when the children tugged at his sleeve, begging him to stay, and when the parents clasped his hands with gratitude too deep for words, he felt the weight of what they had entrusted to him. He promised to visit, though he knew his path would soon return him southward, back to Oak Ridge, a place where secrets lingered and fences still stood, but where his house now held only silence. Before he left, the families gathered once more, lighting candles in their small tenement room. This time, their prayers rose not in whispers, but in steady voices. They prayed for those lost, for those still searching, and for the man who had borne the risk of discovery, so that they might stand in this moment. He bowed his head, humbled, knowing their gratitude was more than he could ever accept. When he walked away into the streets of New York, the city swallowed him whole. Yet behind him, laughter spilled from the windows where once there had been only muffled whispers underground. Children played, mothers planned for schools, fathers spoke of work to be found. The life that had been locked away now unfolded in daylight. Back in Oak Ridge, the basement remained as it had been. Stone walls, low ceiling, and a door with a lock bolted on the outside. To any passerby, it was nothing more than an ordinary space for tools and storage. But within its silence lingered the memory of endurance, the nights of music, the glow of candles, the weight of fear balanced by the stubborn will to survive. History would remember Oak Ridge for the weapon it produced, for the secret that ended a war. Yet within one unremarkable house, another secret endured, a quiet defiance against destruction, a lock that had shielded lives instead of binding them, and a man whose courage was measured not in battles fought, but in families preserved. And though the world beyond Oak Ridge moved on, those who had once huddled beneath its floor carried forward the truth that survival was not only endurance, but the steadfast belief that life, once hidden, could again take root in the open air. The basement is empty now, the lock on the outside silent, but the story of those who survived inside it still echoes through time. If you want more untold stories like this, make sure you're following Eternal Obsidian, where hidden history lives on.